Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Man Yip, Associate Professor of Law and Director of Center for Commercial Law in Asia at Singapore Management University, Yong Tong House School of Law. I'm very delighted today to welcome you to the second panel of the CIBEL-CCLA Banking Law Webinar. Now, we have 5 excellent presentations lined up today that will touch on a wide range of issues that focus on digital trade, digital commerce, digital banking, and digital currencies explored from a variety of perspectives. I will introduce each panelist right before they speak, and our format is our panelists will each speak for 10 minutes before we open up for questions. Our first speaker is Professor Heng Wang, Co-Director of the Herbert Smith Freehills Civil Center, UNSW Law and Justice. Professor Wang is Co-Director of Herbert Smith Freehills China International Business and Economic Law Center, and named Australia's Research Field Leader in International Law by the Australian Newspapers Research 2020 magazine. Now, his topic today is new digital currency and the future of world economy. Over to you, Professor Wang.
Thank you, Yema, and thank you for the kind introduction. It's been great to meet everyone here, and also it's been nice to talk about the new digital currency. And also, please, let's move on to the next slide. What I would like to talk today is about the new digital currency, and what we see that in the broader picture as being a emerging of the global stablecoins, and also a lot of private cryptocurrencies. And as we see, recently the fluctuation of the cryptocurrencies, and there seem to be a quite substantial, competition of the currencies. And the central banks, try to respond to those kind of the dynamics in the sense that, maintain the role of the central banks and also the fiat currency by considering such as the Cbtc, the central bank digital currency, which means a digital form of fiat currency. Example will be China's, EC and yuan and digital euro and so on and so forth. It involves basically software, like how to regulate, what are the technical standards, but also about hardware like financial infrastructure. What do we see nowadays, and one of the focus for what I'm talking today is about the digital currency, particularly central bank digital currency, because they will shape a new ecosystem, in that sense. Apologies for the typo here. And also, we like to see in the context of the currency competition and context. I also post one of the link of a recent paper of mine with Siming Gao of Tsinghua on the related issue. And here we see that actually central bank digital currency is a quite fundamental new generation of money, because in the sense that you now have more data related to central bank digital currency, which is absent for cash, for example. And also behind it is new generation in the sense that they also have new technology. They're a bit, they're different in terms of whether they use DOT technologies. They also have a difference in terms of how do you regulate the flow of the data behind those currency, which are quite different from what happened in the past. So people may think it's kind of game changer in the sense of how central bank will use that, how the commercial banks and others will be able to develop applications and exchange with those kind of new currency. There are basically domestic aspect and international aspects of Cbtc. I will focus more on international aspects. I just want to highlight that actually it means about Cbtc may be used internationally, as already been seen a number of efforts by Bank for International Settlements, some central banks exploring that. I just want to say that here, I don't argue that we should choose Cbtc or they should be used internationally. My talk here is more about, what are the potential issues or the landscape we will see for world economy with the emerging of Cbtc and also the potential international use. So let's move on to the next slide, which I will talk about, briefly, what are the opportunities, challenges, and impact. I think that's, as mentioned earlier, for Cbtc, in the context of the digital age, you have the issue about some key words. One is technology. Cbtc have to center on new technology because they rely on the technical infrastructure and the risk management like cybersecurity. Another side we see that also needs a lot of regulation. because of the ranging from issue like the financial crime compliance and as well as to how do you regulate the use of the CBDC, the obligation rights of different participants. So a lot of regulatory issues. And here we see that there are substantial opportunities, or people may say innovations in terms of potential international use of CBDC as being explored by international organizations and also a number of central banks. So they may help to solve the issues in financial inclusion, increase efficiency, reduce cost, but they may also be used in wholesale markets if they like instant 24 hours, 7 days settlements in context like foreign exchange, security transactions, and in retail markets there may be a one way to promote new business activities, particularly in the e-commerce. But they also have substantial challenges. So technical aspects, how to design the CBDC, even for the blockchain technology explored, there have been different platforms explored by different central banks. How to store that and use that, how to integrate CBDC with payment systems, how to interchange with local currency. So these are a lot of technical issues. You have to connect with different type of CBDCs. And regulatory aspects, they also have issue like cybersecurity, privacy. I think that's data. And here you also have issue about digital identity. How do you ensure interoperability among different CBDCs? And also, we see a lot of impacts, on governments. An easy example will be that, these are CBDCs and global stable coins, for example, may have impacts in the long term over the, US dollar in terms of their as an international reserve currency. They also have a discussion about whether they will have new digital currency, which may play a more dominant role because they are more accessible and are more popular in the markets. And for businesses, you would like to see more different consumer needs and also different business models. They may have reduced demand for correspondence banking, and also they may call for more ecosystem developments based on CBDC and others. And also for individuals, you have issue about privacy protection, as well as issue like whether you are sure that you get sufficient consumer protection in that regard. They also involve other stakeholders, ranging from the agencies regarding the credit rating, technology companies which involved in those process, data processing, as well as the NGOs, who are concerned about the potential issues of the climate change or sustainable issues that may be related to the digital currencies. Although they're more about the cryptocurrency, private cryptocurrencies that may need more energy consumption than CBDC. If we look at the next slides, which is my final slide and also conclusion part, is that what are the future and also what are the possible solutions? I think that's actually absolutely seeing a moving target of the global landscape of economy. The technology is fast changing, and also the regulators, the fintech companies, and also the commercial banks, other stakeholders are trying to see what's their position in the new context. But I think it's like to see that we'll see the coexistence of CBDC with private currencies, but also potential competition among them. So they are kind of interact with each other, depends on what they practice, their popularity, and also their feedback in practice. And essentially, they also have the issue about what's the role of the market and the government. So for example, CBDC strengthens the role of the government or maintain their role through the fiat currency, while private digital currency definitely the role of the markets. And also, second issue is that in the future landscape, that it's likely we need coordination to address financial stability issue, but here is a rocky road because we see that's a divergent regulatory approaches. If you compare China vis-a-vis US, vis-a-vis EU, they are not the same in terms of data flow, in terms of the technology use, and digital identity and so on and so forth. They also have different motivations. Some CBDC may even be used for avoidance of economic sanctions, and also rely on institutional capacity of the states. And underlying that, we would like to see not only technical and regulatory issue, but also issue like the different societal values behind that. And then we see that actually, what are the solutions? It won't be an easy answer. I would like to conclude saying that we have to balance within different factors like efficiency and safety. You may want to have more efficiency, but if you want to check with the security, they may slow down the process. And I just want to conclude that we need a forward-looking approach, because the shifting landscape, experimental mindset, to make sure that adjust to the changes in practice and problems, and regulator, for example, may need also move ahead of the changes. So I will conclude here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Han, for that very clear overview on CBDC from a global and also domestic perspective. Now, our second speaker is Associate Professor Pasha Xia from SMU Yong Fong House School of Law. Pasha is the Associate Dean Faculty Matters and Research and also an established trade law expert. Now, today, his topic is on the Rsap and New Asian Regionalism. Over to you, Pasha.
Okay, thank you very much, Yeman, for the introduction. May I have this slide, please? Thank you very much. We can go to the next slide. So today, my focus will be on the Rsap, which is the world's largest free trade agreement. We can go to the next slide. Yeah. Professor Jadis Bhagwati of Columbia Law School coined the term first regionalism that referred to trade agreement in the 1960s, but at that time, most trade agreements failed for political reasons. In the second regionalism, we witnessed some limited success, including European single market and NAFTA in North America. In the third wave of global regionalism, which I call the third regionalism, which has developed in tandem with the Doha round since the 2000s. And the most important development is New Asian regionalism, which include the following features: the emergence of mega regional trade agreement and South-South FTA, meaning that agreement concluded between developing countries. So we have some key examples, including ASEAN Economic Communities, the Cptpp, and the Rsap, which was concluded in 2020. The next slide, please. Why the Rsap is significant? Because 15 countries account for 30% of global GDP and 40% of global merger and acquisitions. And Rsap include major countries such as China, ASEAN, Korea, Japan, but India decided to withdraw from negotiation in 2019. And the Rsap will not only facilitate the trade the regional supply chain, but will also consolidate the 4 existing ASEAN Plus 1 FTA. If we look at the current ASEAN Plus 1 FTA, meaning that ASEAN's FTA with Australia, New Zealand, China, Korea, and Japan, one typical problem is the very low utilization rate, meaning that not many people actually use those FTA. In the case of ASEAN-Japan FTA, only 2.3% importers actually use the FTA. So Rsap will address this major problem. Next slide, please. So we like rankings. So here I provide the ranking of trade agreement based on their share of global GDP. Here you can see Rsap is number 1, 30% of global GDP, which is comparable in terms of the economic scale, comparable to that of the European Union, 27 member states, and Cptpp 50 members combined. So that's why it's quite significant. And other South-based FTA, such as African Continental FTA, ASEAN, Mercosur, Pacific Alliance, you can see the economic scale. In terms of economic scale, they are relatively insignificant. So the Rsap is truly an exception. Next slide, please. So now let me talk about the Rsap historical background. At the inception of the third regionalism, China proposed the ASEAN Plus 3 agreement, meaning that ASEAN and China, Japan, Korea. And Japan wanted to counteract China's influence, so that Tokyo proposed the ASEAN Plus 6 framework, including ASEAN Plus 3 and Australia, New Zealand, and India. So ASEAN in 2020 2012 proposed the new guideline for the Rsap in order to retain the notion of ASEAN centrality and also provide special and differential treatment to certain countries such as Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. So the Rsap was concluded in 2020. So far, 4 countries have ratified the Rsap: Thailand, Singapore, China, Japan. For Rsap to come into effect, we need 6 ASEAN countries and 3 non-ASEAN countries. So we still need 4 ASEAN countries and 1 non-ASEAN country. And it is expected that the Rsap will come into force this year. Next slide, please. Let me also clarify 3 important myths regarding Rsap. First, the ASEAN is led by ASEAN. The Rsap is led by ASEAN and instead being led by China, and it will transform the ASEAN way to hard law rules with structural flexibility. And the Rsap will fill the current FTA gap because currently Japan has no FTA with China, Korea, New Zealand, and the Rsap will fill the gap. But we should know that the Rsap will not supersede intra-Rsap FTA or investment agreement. So the Rsap will promote harmonization on a de facto basis because business may choose Rsap over existing FTA or VIT. Next slide, please. And the following important issue, the third myth, is that many people say that Rsap is of low quality and ambition, particularly when it's compared to Cptpp. And yes, here I provide the chart so that you can see the major differences between Rsap and the Cptpp. It's true that the Rsap does not have provisions on state-owned enterprises, no labor and environmental protection or anti-corruption clauses, and no investor-state dispute settlement. But we should know that it's true that Rsap is not a rule maker, but it will significantly harmonize or expand the current trade rule, and that is very important and often ignored by many academics. The next slide, please. One important issue is tariff liberalization. The Rsap is not exceptional, so the current rate of liberalization is 92 to 95%, consistent with existing ASEAN Plus 1 FTA. Rsap has significant exclusion and extended phase-in period. For example, Japan excluded imported agricultural products from liberalization. And many countries want to export cars to China, but China entered U, meaning that no commitment for imported cars. And even tariff for car parts, automotive parts, will only reach 0 in the 16th year. So the process will be quite slow. But as I said before, one important issue is to harmonize rules of origin, meaning that now you only need to use Rsap, 1 certificate of origin, so instead of using different certificate of origins under current ASEAN Plus 1 FTAs. Next slide, please. And in terms of the services, the service commitment are extremely complicated because some countries use positive list approach, some countries use the negative list approach. But it would take time for the service trade to be further facilitated by the Rsap. In terms of investment, Rsap is like ASEAN-Hong Kong investment agreement. There's no ISDS provisions. One of the major reasons is New Zealand, which changed its stance on ISDS in 2017. However, ASEAN country can still use state-to-state dispute settlement mechanism to solve investment issues or use current investment agreement. Next slide, please. In terms of the government procurement, the Rsap has provisions on public procurement, but it has no specific commitment. In terms of digital trade, we know that the COVID-19 has driven a 70% increase in e-commerce orders. The Rsap, just like other FTA, prohibit the data localizations and barriers to the cross-border transfer of data, although great. However, Rsap provides significant exception. For example, the Rsap members can deviate the rules based on a legitimate public policy objective or essential security interest. The interesting part of the Rsap is that the countries themselves can decide whether or not the public policy is illegitimate or whether or not security interests are essential. So that creates a lot of a vast policy space. The next slide, please. And there are also systematic issues because there are foreign shopping between WTO and Rsap versus FTA, because all of these mechanisms have dispute settlement mechanisms. So that is a very important issue in terms of international economic law. The Rsap will also establish secretariat. That is also very important. And ultimately, the Rsap will benefit the APEC's goal to establish 21-member free trade area of the Asia Pacific. If we look at Article 20, Rsap will be open for accession to stay as separate custom territory. So that's a very good sign. Last slide, please. So I've presented several important issues regarding Rsap, and so that it is expected that the Rsap will have a salient impact on new Asian regionalism. And if you want to know more about the Rsap and other FTA, I have a new book which will be published this year and next year. And so this is the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pasha, for the insight to sharing. So if you do have questions on the impact of Rsap on digital trade or banking, do input your question in Q&A later. Now, we move on to our third speaker. Joining us today is Mr. Joey Pang, Senior Vice President of Legal and Compliance at DBS Bank. Mr. Joey Pang is an experienced law leader with a demonstrated track record in tackling technology, export control, and competition issues. So from this part of the webinar, we are going to transition more into the industry perspectives on how digital trade, digital commerce actually operate on the ground. Now, Joey's topic today is on banking on the future, digital bank or technology company with a banking license. Over to you, Joey.
Hey, thanks, Ip. Where we are coming from today, and given that today is going to be a post-COVID world economy seminar, I thought it may be interesting that we talk about this first from a perspective of what's happening and then how COVID has changed that. So I think as early as in 1994, in the next slide, we have a statement from someone who is in the news for separate reasons now, but who have put out a very interesting statement and said that banking is necessary, but banks are not. And it is in fact an echo of another statement which is more general, which is software is eating the world. And what is essentially happening is that there isn't a need, there's a recognition that there isn't necessarily a need for people to get banking services from banks. And this is a key realization to banks and to financial institutions that we must pivot and transition. So that statement was made in 1994. 2021, we are still here, not just DBS, but a whole host of other banks as well. And it begs the question of, is that statement first necessarily true, given that almost 20 years and 20 over years, nearly 30 years has passed since that statement was uttered? And if indeed it was true, then why are we still here? Why is it that we are still here in terms of banking being necessary, but banks are not? So to understand that landscape a bit better, it might be worthwhile for us to take a look at what exactly comprises the banking ecosystem. So in the next slide, you'll see that the current banking ecosystem, and I've tried to simplify this to a great degree, essentially comprises of four main types of actors. I mean, you have your banks. So I think banks are not unfamiliar to us. DBS is a bank. In Australia, you have your big four banks, your National Australian Bank, Macquarie, ANZ, whatnot. And then these are the banks that our parents grew up with, that we grew up with. And some of these banks may or may not exist as our children grow up. Then you have the new banks. And the question then becomes, what is new about these banks? In some jurisdiction, you call them digital banks. In Singapore, we call them digital banks. In some jurisdiction, you call them neobanks. So these are UK, for instance. In Hong Kong, you call them virtual banks. But the concept is the same, that essentially these are so-called startup banks that has attractive features. And one of the key characteristics of new banks is their devolution from the physical medium of banking. Meaning, I don't need to open branches, I don't need ATMs, I can just provide all the banking services through the mobile devices, through the computer, through a software medium. And then moving on, you have your fintechs, and fintech is a short form for financial technology companies, and some of these fintech companies offer financial services directly to the end consumers. Some of them provide the technology to allow either your neobanks or your banks to provide these services themselves. And I think examples of that will be people like your Stripe, your Everlog, your TransferWise. So all these are not new to consumers, and people are starting to see how financial services can be provided without necessarily involving a bank. So for instance, TransferWise, they do a healthy remittance business, and in a lot of ways, it allows people to relate to how services can be obtained without necessarily going to a more traditional medium like a bank. So whereas in the bank, in the past, you need to go and send a telegraphic transfer, you need to go to your Western Union to do certain types of things. Currently, these are being disintermediated, and you have these fintechs either offering it themselves or offering it to banks and other sorts of financial entities to do this. And then finally, you have the adjacents. And the adjacents are interesting because they are part of the system, but they are not part of the system. But they are coming into the system because money is where the system is at. So I think in this part of our world, it'll be players like your Grab, your C, it can be InsurTech as well, like your OneConnect. It can also be people like your Xero accounting software. And there are some very interesting examples that can be said about all these InsurTech companies. And so if this is the banking ecosystem and landscape, I think the first point to be noted at this juncture is that banks are no longer just confined to the first quadrant. And increasingly, the banks who are thriving and the banks who are surviving well, we are seeing themselves extend across the spectrum. So I can give you an example of DBS. I mean, we are a bank in Singapore. We are a bank in maybe even Hong Kong or other places. But in places like India, in places like Indonesia, we are more like a neobank. We don't really have a lot of branches. In fact, we started off with 0 branches, and we provided banking services like a neobank. And then in some other areas, increasingly, as we go out to push out for things like digital exchanges, we start settlement networks. Like I think recently there was a launch by DBS together with JP Morgan and Temasek on Partior, which is an international settlement network using blockchain. We're behaving more like a fintech. And of course, then we are moving into the adjacent. So no, for now, DBS is not selling coffee yet, but we never know. Yeah. So I think the main thing is that the banks that we're talking about today is very different from the banks of the 1994 that Bill Gates was talking about. And increasingly, we are acquiring those characteristics of non-banks. And similarly, for the other players in the spectrum, the reverse is happening. That while they may have been in other businesses, they may be operating in other ways, they're coming closer to how traditional banks are operating. So there's a convergence. So what is the future of banking then? Next slide, please. I think regardless of the model that you're looking at and you're coming from, the future of banking comes down to 3 things. I think the first one is easy to understand concept, but hard to implement concept. Essentially, if you want to make money and you want to make a difference, you need to be able to scale. And that means being able to deploy in not just great numbers, but also in great segments. And execution remains key in that regard. And in terms of the main challenge, there are 2. I think one is about geopolitical and fragmentation of geopolitics and fragmentation of regulations. I think Pasha and Heng Wang has spoken about this in some way and forms in terms of how there are different regulations. There are ways and means for us to bring this together, either through bilateralism, regionalism, globalization, but differences exist. I mean, not least the differences between China and the West at this juncture. And on a more industrial perspective, we are having a differentiated competition landscape. And what I mean by that is that we are all coming from places of different advantages. So while a fintech may be more agile, may have better user interface and user experience in the way that they design their services and product offerings and addressing pain points. This is not something that comes very naturally to banks, but banks have to move towards that and to adapt to that competitive landscape. And for the new entrants, be it your fintech companies or your adjacents who wants to move forward to do banking, the same is true in terms of the need to have more robust controls, your compliance, and to have more capitalization requirements, things that are more familiar to banks but less familiar to them. So there is some level of unevenness in the competition, but all is fair now. And lastly, in terms of the last slide, we can then draw about three main things that's happening. So we don't really think that COVID has changed the landscape in that sense of that trend. But what it has done is it has forced the acceleration of digital transformation because physical medium are being shunned for good reasons, not least because of the spread of disease and the control of disease requires that to happen. And accordingly, if you're going to place more emphasis on the technology and the way to use technology to extend your business, there is huge knock-on effects on trying to deal with technology risk management and compliance. And finally, and in terms of the value of technology, I think there's always been an appreciation of technology, but I think the onset of COVID has forced us to address that. And I will let us end with that one last example, which is, I think DBS Bank, one of the things that we've done is we have always prided ourselves on being quite digital. And the main thing about being digital is it only counts if it makes money or it makes you less money. So on that, there is an interesting example that I can share if we have time later in the Q&A. But thanks so much.
Thank you, Joey. And we would love to hear more from you during the Q&A session. And it's also good to know that DBS is not currently selling coffee, because I wanted to ask whether there's delivery, given that Singapore is in a half lockdown mode at the moment. Now, moving on to our fourth speaker is Mr. Claudio Lisco, Managing Director of Consensus Australia. Claudio leads the development of strategic initiatives and enterprise solutions in Australia and Southeast Asia for Consensus, a leading blockchain venture production studio. So he will tell us a lot about technology, and it's also notable that for his work, Claudio was recognized by Forbes magazine as part of their 30 Under 30 Europe 2017 list. So I hand the time over to Claudio, please. Your topic today is Cbtc and stablecoins, an opportunity to accelerate digital trade and commerce in Asia Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and thanks for having me today. Just waiting for the slides to pop up. I'm going to start by giving a quick introduction about Consensus, purely because, differently from the previous speakers, I recognize that you might know about the company I work for. So we are a leading blockchain company that was established in the US, and we now operate globally. We focus on enabling developers, enterprises, governments, and financial institutions, as well as people worldwide, to access and adopt blockchain technology. And we're building a number of products and solutions that facilitate that. In recent years, we have been working very closely with central banks and financial institutions across the globe. And in the next slide, I'm going to give an overview of the Cbtc projects that we have developed so far. So what you see here on the screen is effectively a range of projects that Consensus has developed since 2017 in Asia Pacific. These projects are interesting in the context of the discussion because effectively they span the entire spectrum of central bank digital currency projects, as well as stablecoin projects in the region. We started in 2017 with the Monetary Authority of Singapore with participation in phase 2 of Project Ubin, where we supported the development of a central bank digital currency that was used to test real-time interbank clearing and settlement, so in the wholesale space. And effectively, that experiment at the time demonstrated that Cdbc issued on blockchain could be used as an alternative to real-time gross settlement systems. And now Project Ubin is in the latest phases of the project, and is actually going to implement that type of technology solution with the participation of the financial industry in Singapore. The second project that you see there is a collaboration between the Hong Kong Monetary Authority and Bank of Thailand. In this collaboration, effectively, Bank of Thailand and HKMA tested the usage of Cbtc for interbank cross-border payments and payment versus payment solution. So an example of a project that saw two central banks in Asia collaborating to execute currency conversion and payment versus payment settlement on blockchain. The third project is a local project in Australia. We're currently collaborating with the Reserve Bank and with National Australia Bank, Commerzbank, and Perpetual to test how wholesale central bank digital currency can be used for atomic settlement of digital securities, effectively facilitating the delivery versus payment process when it comes to settle capital markets trade. The fourth project that you see there was a project from Bank of Thailand, third phase of Project Internet, where we helped Bank of Thailand establishing a retail version of central bank digital currency that can be used for corporate payments in the context of supply chain transaction and settling of invoices. So as you can see, as we move through the slide, we are effectively entering in the space of central bank digital currency no longer being used for interbank transaction and capital market transactions, but also for usage of businesses and retail. In this project, effectively, Bank of Thailand has published a report that declares that there are significant advantages of using central bank digital currency when it comes to supply chain transactions, because effectively it facilitates the integration of payment flows and business flows. Then moving on to the final projects here, we have the Union Bank project in the Philippines, which is called Project I2I, where we created a platform to facilitate domestic remittances between rural banks. I'm going to talk about this project in more details in a second, so I'll leave it there. And then the last project is a project that we executed with Oxfam in Australia, where we actually used a pure stablecoin issued on a public blockchain to effectively send money from Australia to Vanuatu and distribute financial aid to the population on the ground as a response of a natural emergency that occurred in Vanuatu. So very important for this slide to summarize is that, as you can see, Cdbc and stablecoins can be used across a different range of use cases. And we're seeing both central bank, private banks, but even NGOs and enterprise adopting this type of solution to support their needs. Next slide, please. So I was mentioning the Union Bank project earlier, and this is a project that is very close to me because I led the implementation of the project, but also because at the end of the day, it's about financial inclusion. Union Bank came to us with a challenge, and the challenge was to establish a domestic payment network that could support rural banks in the Philippines to facilitate the execution of domestic remittances and drive financial inclusion that way. But also the important step of this project was creating and introducing blockchain-based financial services into the country so that Union Bank could start building an ecosystem around it. We started the project in 2018. The video is not playing, but you will have seen our team going into Surigao del Norte to do research and user interviews to understand how to implement the solution. We then ran a first pilot with 6 rural banks onboarded, and then we launched the solution in June 2019, and now we have more than 100 rural banks on the platform. Next slide, please. So the minimum viable product of Project I2I effectively demonstrated that a blockchain network can be used to connect rural banks in remote areas of the Philippines and allow them to transact in a digitized way by relying on a bank account at Union Bank to act as a clearing and settlement facilities for the rural banks that were actually interacting in digital currency. Effectively, we moved from a clunky, long, and expensive process in the traditional manner to something that was fully digitized, that didn't need any reconciliation step, was executing money transfer in near real time, and was able to execute this money transfer for a 1 peso flat fee. Next slide, please. Now, that was just a starting point, and this is a very important characteristic from my perspective of Cdbc and tokenized cash projects, because they're usually a starting point, and then they enable many more use cases to be built around it. That's exactly what Union Bank did in the Philippines, because after they had built this cash tokenization facility for Project I2I, they started using this cash tokenization facility also for other use cases. So that same tokenized cash was then used to support micro-lending, was used to facilitate cross-border remittances in partnership with OCBC in Singapore, was used also to entertain and start discussion with the Banco Central of the Philippines around central bank digital currency, and finally to support the settlement and investment in retail government bonds that were also issued on the Ethereum blockchain later last year. So as you can see, this type of projects around digital currencies and stablecoin can effectively accelerate the digital ecosystem and accelerate innovation and adoption of other blockchain solutions and use cases in financial services. Next slide, please. So to summarize, I believe that the projects that I've mentioned so far, and then also the more concrete example of Project I2I, give us effectively a good overview of what are the opportunities that are enabled by Cdbc and stablecoins. Obviously, we have a lot of benefits in capital markets with the opportunity to improve wholesale settlement, and this means effectively driving more efficiency to capital market trades and transactions. The second one is enabling more efficient cross-border payments and cross-border remittances, which obviously can have an important effect on digital commerce and digital trade across the region. There is also an element of security because central bank digital currency and stablecoin can enable digital escrow solution that can limit counterparty risk and other risk associated with the transmission of payment. Then there is a very important element of deeper integration with business flows. These central bank digital currency stablecoins are effectively programmable, and you can deeply embed them in business flows like supply chain flows, trade flows, investment flows, so that it can self-execute and self-distribute payments as needed. Then the other very important element, which we touched on in the context of the I2I project with Union Bank, is that this type of digital currency also allow a very efficient retail distribution that can support financial inclusion and participation in the financial system, also in rural areas that are normally not well covered by traditional financial services. And then the last and probably most important bit is that this digital currency foster digital assets revolution. So they can create a new ecosystem of digital assets and use cases. And with this, I'm done. So I'm going to look forward for questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudio, and thanks for the sharing of the projects that are consensus with the different countries and the different companies. So we move on to our final presentation by Ms. Susanna Wilkinson from Herbert Smith Freehills. I just want to mention here very quickly that Herbert Smith Freehills is a sponsor of CIBEL and also a long-time partner with CCLA at SMU. Now, Susanna is the digital law lead for APAC at Herbert Smith Freehills, driving digital transformation of law through the development of smart legal contracts. She has 16 years experience with leading firms in Australia, the UK, Russia, assisting clients to navigate complex infrastructure, renewable energy, and automation projects. And she will be sharing with us on legal frontier, contracts, and infrastructure in the digital age. Please, Susanna.
Thank you so much for having me. Just make sure everyone can hear me okay, but it's great to be here. And thanks so much, Claudio, for those really interesting examples of what you're doing with CBDCs. I think that leads in really nicely to what I'd like to talk about. And I think if we step back at this point and look at an acknowledgement that digitalization or digital transformation is taking place right across all aspects of the global economy, and it's really entwining itself into our lives, and you gave some really good examples there of how CBDCs are facilitating those direct payments. But there are two key elements that I believe will really shape the future digital economies. And as in the introduction, how do we as lawyers and more broadly across the economy, how do we digitize the contracts that underpin all economic activity? They really are the connective tissue between what is already a digitalized world in many ways. So we've got lots of different pockets of digitized systems, but at the moment, the contracts that underpin a lot of those transactions are actually disconnected from those digital systems. And then if that is the case, if that's the future state we want, then when contracts become digital assets, how do we ensure the integrity in the digital infrastructure that we're going to need to run a truly digital economy? And by that, I mean not so much just individual digital platforms that are performing certain use cases, but how do we link all of those together in a way that embeds the sort of integrity that we want from those digital infrastructure pieces. So let's just explore smart legal contracts for a moment. And in law, and contracts play a vital role in maintaining confidence in the interconnected and increasingly complex and abstracted systems that we have. The legal industry itself is going through digital transformation, both in terms of the legal processes. We know that any inefficient or expensive process is sort of ripe for disruption, and the law certainly has plenty of those. But we're also looking at a change in the functionality of legal instruments, and that's where the smart legal contracts come in. Lawyers have traditionally been a little bit slow to the digital party, but it's very clear to me that we need to do more than just keep up. We actually need to jump ahead, take the lead in embedding legal and ethical guardrails into our future ecosystems. So businesses are looking at how do we take contracts and make them digital. We've already got code that's running around performing certain functions, but how do we marry the two together? And this is where we've spent a lot of time working on the development of smart legal contracts. Legal contracts really sit in a static form, if you think about it, and they don't allow for real-time tracking and performance, but they still need humans. And we've got contract management systems that come into play to manage that as an ad hoc way. But we think that the days of sort of contracts sitting as an analog record are over. They should be and can be dynamic digital forms of governance and management tools that can speak to all of these wonderful other digital products that we have. So if we look at the next slide briefly, this is just an infographic that shows when we talk about taking a contract from paper form and going through that digital transformation and automation journey, what's the role of the digital platforms in that? When does something go from being just a digital record of a contract to actually having the functionality of a digitally connected and smart legal contract? Now, I don't have a lot of time, so I won't speak to all of those elements in detail, but there's further information in the link if you're interested. But I think we need to just clarify at this point that a smart contract is different from a smart legal contract. We have a smart contract, which is code executing on blockchain platform or Ethereum. We're talking about taking a legal contract and enhancing it with the benefits of automation. So I think these smart legal contracts are an inevitable outcome because they're going to allow parties to obtain legal certainty in this automation and contractual performance piece more broadly than tokenization and all some of the great use cases that are happening already. SLCs are going to play a really important role in the adoption of digital assets like CBDCs. Because if you think of CBDC as a packet of data or some of these other digital assets with certain variables and information contained in that package, as you start to increase the number of variables and the internal rules and governance processes within a digital asset, you start to need more legal certainty around what is that digital asset, how does it interact with the world around it, and encoding rules into a digital asset really leads to sort of two things. When I talk about that, I mean encoding rules into what would be a smart legal contract. We need to start introducing the rules, but we need to look at the form and functionality of that digital contract in the way that it starts to depend on and coexist with the digital infrastructure. So in my mind, if we're serious about transitioning to a digital economy, across the board, we need to really think very carefully about what is the plumbing that underpins this economy. So if we move to the next slide, we've recognised that contracts are a special class of asset that underpin the economy, and in a well-functioning society, then we need to start looking at things like the safe storage of those contracts and their data throughout the contract life cycle. And that suddenly becomes really, really important. We don't have a lot of time to go into it, but if you think of a contract as software, it's no longer two separate records of the same sort of evidence of a contract, but rather it becomes a single shared piece of software between counterparties. So how we treat that digital asset is very different to how we have historically treated a digital record of an analog contract. So it's really important, I think, to acknowledge that this new machine readable format for contracts requires new contract infrastructure, and that's going to have to be backed by public and private investment and development of new contract technology. One of the main barriers to a shift to digital contracting, and we had that great quote from 1994 earlier on, you know, some of these concepts have been around for a really long time. Why has it taken so long for contracts to catch up? But a key barrier to the shift has been that digital contracting and smart legal contracts don't have an available sort of cyber secure, user-friendly, industry-agnostic infrastructure piece that will allow businesses to move into this digital realm in their day-to-day BAU contracting that can speak to all of the cool digital functionality that we already have. So we think lawyers have a real role to play, and I would welcome any of you out there who are interested in this to reach out. So what we're doing at the moment is engaging with law councils and law commissions around the world to interrogate what we think are the minimum requirements of digital infrastructure in order to maintain the integrity that we think is required for best practice. So how do we secure the future safe provision and execution of the law? So some of the concepts are on the slide in front of you, but privacy and cybersecurity, ethical use of algorithms, these are all well-known concepts, but we need to look at them through a lens of how do they apply when we have individuals looking to contract in a truly digital ecosystem, and the contract itself depends on that infrastructure. So in the same way that we make sure there are access to courts and access to justice, maybe as simply as having a wheelchair access ramp, we need to make sure that we don't end up in a situation where we have a portion of the population who don't have access to that digital infrastructure, whether that's through corporate policies or commercial drivers, or maybe it's the absence of government policy and regulation. We think that digital contract infrastructure should be technically designed and legally governed in a way that ensures the data is protected and not unacceptably exploited. We need strong, trusted governance and social license to operate, which is becoming increasingly a key factor in the successful adoption of digital emerging technologies. And adoption of the digital economy's opportunities and that digital infrastructure offering is likely to be limited unless it's trusted, accountable and credible. So we've been, as I said, we've been working with various law commissions and law councils to start to explore what some of these minimum requirements would be, with a view to having sort of a protocol that people can refer to, whether they're developers or industry, governments, to refer back to and make sure that we are putting the right guardrails in place for this future digital economy. And that's probably all I really need to say. There's a lot of information in there. Happy to speak to anyone further or take questions in the Q&A. There's a few links on the slide there if you're interested in reading the protocol. It's very short, but it's intended to highlight sort of the complexity and critical role that a digital platform and enterprise platform will play in hosting smart legal contracts because of their shifting nature. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Susanna. Thank you all for keeping to time so perfectly. We'll now move on to the Q&A segment. So if I may direct the speakers to the live Q&A box. Yep, you see that the number of questions is directed to the entire panel, but I will start with the one that came in first, and that gives time for other speakers to think about your answers to some of these more general questions. So the first question is for Pasha, right? Do you think that the Rsap represents a new model of trade agreements compared with Cptpp and WTO rules? If so, what is the Asian flavor in it? Or it is a kind of WTO style agreement? Yeah, Pasha, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for this excellent question. My response to this question is that the Rsap is neither the Cptpp type or the WTO type agreement. And from my perspective, the Rsap emphasized the concept of pragmatism, which is a new model or a more suitable model for a trade agreement. To a certain extent, it reflects the legal culture of many Asian jurisdictions, where we see contract as the legal framework rather than an instrument that detail our obligations. And to a certain extent also reflect my argument that with Singapore, the other approach, which I call the horizontal approach, that emphasizes what the Rsap wants to achieve. Some important aspect about the Rsap, what countries, for example, labor law or environmental law, environmental protection clauses. And so these clauses are often known as the value-based components that the EU and the US often emphasize. And so the Asian countries find it easy not to have these components. And also the emphasis on development, which is something that is important to Asian countries as well as ASEAN countries. So that so these are my responses to the question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pasha. Now move on to the next question, which has 2 likes already. So audience, if you want a particular question to be addressed, do vote on them. Now, so this question is directed to the entire panel, but with Heng perhaps to take the first, to be the first to answer this question, right? What do you think are the major regulatory and legal issues arising from Cbdc? Are there convergence or divergence in the regulatory approaches?
Thank you, Yema. I think maybe I can try to answer some of the question here. I think it's been a lot of questions, in terms of Cbdc, starting from the monetary law, whether central bank is able to issue Cbdc, a tokenized, digital currency, and then you have the issue about how to allocate the rights and obligations among different participants in the system. So we are thinking of technology platforms, thinking about central banks, commercial banks, who could be operator, redemption of the Cbdc, and what do you think of the data flow, and what's the regulator requirements for data, and also there are requirements, for example, about financial compliance, crime compliance. There's also issue about taxation, and also the issue about financial inclusion. And also even the issue like, where you will be able to address the problem if you have technical difficulties, whether people can refuse to use the Cbdc. And also in what circumstances we can stop the transaction of Cbdc. It can be very controversial to show that there could be divergent view, if you have one country have very strict rules, how do you stop that? I mean, public policy can be read in total different manner. So I would say there are a huge number of question marks, ranging from central bank, banking regulators, to tax authorities, consumer protection, competition authorities, and also to the different states. So I see there are a lot of efforts needed to try to, as mentioned by Susanna, that maybe a minimum requirements or by other colleagues, to build confidence in that system. So I think events like this will be really helpful to explore potential wealth. Thank you.
Thank you, Pasha. And we have just heard from Claudio on the different projects that he has done, right? So perhaps you could share your perspective from the ground, right? What are some of these regulatory challenges or opportunities that you would characterize them as?
Sure. So I think one of the very common questions that we work through with regulators and central banks when we run these projects is actually, what is central bank digital currency? And this is like a century-old question that goes back to what is money, right? And ultimately, the key models that we survey there is whether central bank digital currency is entirely a new form of money, which is expressed in digital form, or whether it's considered effectively an extension to existing form of money, like we have today with electronic payment methods or RTGS systems and things like that. Many central banks and regulators are taking different approaches around this effectively, and answering this very fundamental question then has important effects on the characterization of Cdbc and also the other related questions around this in terms of who can actually access and transact in Cdbc, how it can be stored, whether there is interest paid directly on Cdbc or interest is paid on deposits that then generated Cdbc. So I think as much as the industry is making lots of progress and many central banks, especially in the Asia Pacific region, are now very advanced on the topic, the question around the characterization of Cdbc and its form in the monetary system, from my perspective, still remains the fundamental one. And depending on that, then we will be able to also solve the other regulatory questions. I don't think any of the central bank right now has taken a very strong view and position on this. Many are, taking the direction of considering central bank digital currency as an alternative form of money and alternative payment method. But it's going to be interesting to see how this evolves in the coming years.
Yeah. Perhaps Joey, would you like to share the commercial bank's perspective? In fact, there's a specific question for you in the live Q&A. It says that, what are the major impacts of CBDC, stablecoins, and private cryptocurrencies on commercial banks? Will CBDC lead to higher costs for funding by commercial banks? Given the different and even possibly conflicting regulatory approaches of digital currencies, such as data flow, how would commercial banks address the diversion requirements? I think you need to unmute yourself, Joey.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So I think got 4 questions in that one comment bubble. And let's first talk about CBDC, stablecoins, and private cryptocurrencies and their impacts on commercial bank. They are all different. So if you think about it, stablecoins and private cryptocurrencies on some level share more characteristic with each other than CBDCs, if only from the fact of who are the issuers of such currencies. I think there's a lot of debate, especially in the US, if you're following the Ripple litigation about whether or not there is a central issuer and then whether they falls foul of security regulations or whatnot. But the general sense of it is that when it comes down to CBDC at least, where it's issued by government authorities, be it a central bank or entity that's authorized by a central bank, you have that issue that it is a lawful issuance of currency, albeit in an electronic form. The impacts on CBDC, therefore, then comes down to whether or not the infrastructure on which the CBDC is designed around is an open one, and what degree of governmental control the government has or the authority has on the CBDC. And the reason for this is that it will lead us to answer that second question about whether or not CBDC is going to lead to higher cost of funding, right? Because ideally, if you have the infrastructure in place and everything is electronic, it should lead to lower cost of funding because there's efficiency in terms of your ability to have different systems dynamically allocate capital and have access to different sorts of capital. But there is a tension there in relation to the degree of state control, right? So if your state imposes a lot of controls, technical and technological controls on CBDCs that's being issued, and it creates a lot of costs associated with those controls, that's where we will see that potentially there may be higher cost of funding by banks or anyone wishing to avail themselves of CBDCs. The implications of stablecoins and private cryptocurrencies on commercial bank, I don't think this is a new issue. The main thing is the private actor, the credibility of the private actor in relation to the acceptance of the stable coins and the private cryptocurrencies, and the associated money laundering, combating of financial terrorism kind of issues. So those are not new. It's just that those have taken on a new complexion and complication from the fact that there is a easy sort of anonymity that may accompany some of the design of these cryptocurrencies or stablecoins. So from that perspective, then that leads to higher costs if the issuers of those currencies are not responsible or are not deemed to be responsible, and if a commercial individual or a commercial actor wants to partake in that kind of trade, say DBS Bank or whichever bank, for instance, then the regulatory expectation from your regulator is not going to be, oh, because it is a new cowboy kind of business that you're doing, I expect less from you. In fact, the reverse is expected. You're expected to do a lot more and have a lot less risk appetite in relation to your exposure to such assets. So I think coming down to the last question, in terms of the regulatory approaches and how would commercial banks address the diversion requirements, it's not so bleak actually. So I mean, I would take an analog example instead of a digital example. So look at Chinese yuan, right? I mean, Chinese yuan is not a fully and freely convertible currency. Now we have offshore yuan and we have onshore yuan. How do you make money out of the state controls and the diversion between that and a freely convertible system? You be the middleman and you make things happen in terms of ensuring that there's a lawful way of ensuring convertibility. So I think where there is differences in legislation or regulatory approach, if you are in the right position at the right place to be able to interface, there's actually profit to be made in terms of navigating those systems and those diversion requirements. Yeah.
Thank you. Now I'm going to steer the discussion a bit more to now smart contracts, because I think that the discussion on Cbtc will generate even further questions. So I'm waiting for those to come in. So my attention now turns to Susanna, right? You see that you're very popular. We have like, I don't know, 10 questions from 3 attendees in the live Q&A. And this, I think two are actually related and quite related to my own research, right? So the first question is, what are some aspects of smart contracts that are most likely to still require human intervention, right? You know, would this be dispute resolution methods regarding the interface between virtual and the physical, which is, I think, tied in with another question on, you know, the role of lawyers when it comes to automatic execution and formation of smart legal contracts. You know, requires more technical than legal inputs. You know, how much technological knowledge is required for a lawyer? So it's human input as well as how much technological knowledge, right, that human person must acquire, right? Over to you, Susanna.
Yeah. Perfect. Two excellent questions, and questions that we get often. I think when we acknowledge the intersection of humans and the physical and the digital dimensions, there's always going to be an interface. I think when we think about smart legal contracts, the tendency is to think about the pure code and how do we express an entire contract in pure code. We think there's a different way to think about it, because not every provision of a contract lends itself to computer code logic drafting, or to be expressed in some intermediary language that is a really structured formal language. But we think of it rather from taking a legal package and adding the benefit of automation, where there are parts of that contract that lend themselves to automation. So be that an automated notification, a calculation, a payment, a connection, a contract, information or output from a contract acting as an oracle source to another contract. And we've got lots of real world examples of that. I think you will never completely solve for the human machine interface where that contract comes live, but to the extent that we are automating processes in a warehouse, or to the extent that you are dealing with autonomous trucks driving around a mine site, the human machine interface is narrowing, but you'll never get rid of it completely. And that's not the purpose of the smart legal contract. We are, as I said, looking at how do you take a traditional legal contract and push it through the stages of digitization and automation and get to that sort of other end of the spectrum where you would have a fully autonomous contract, and they would be very limited use cases. So hopefully that answers the question. I could take further questions on that, but I'll just flip to the next question, which was around how do lawyers do this? We don't all have coding skills. nor is it reasonable to expect that we will. So I think lawyers need to understand the digital realm better. I think we need to understand conceptually what is possible when you break open the black box of a tech stack. I don't think it's realistic to think that every lawyer will sit down and free code a smart legal contract. So to my mind, the solution is in the user interface, or the way that providers of these solutions can draw lawyers in a way where we can work as part of a multidisciplinary team to understand the contracts that we draft today govern processes, and those processes are increasingly digitalized. So we need to be better at understanding how the inputs and outputs of our contract, even in a natural language expression, actually interact with the digital systems. And then I think once we start to think differently as lawyers and work in the multidisciplinary teams with the right tools, then that will give us an entry into smart legal contracts.
Thank you. I just want to have a follow-on question, right? As a law professor, I just wonder what your advice would be for law school who might be looking at, reforming or reviewing their current curriculum. Would there be a need to introduce coding, even as a basic course, or what would your advice be? How should we shape our future curriculum?
How should we say? Look, I think it's true across the board in every profession, every industry. The digital natives have an advantage. They're going to live in a world that is so much more digitized than the world that I grew up in. So do I think every lawyer needs to learn to code? No. But do I think they need to understand conceptually how computers work, what code does, that level of understanding, computational logic, thinking. I've done some courses on blockchain and smart contract development, and I had no idea that of the two species of humans, there's only really two species of humans that care so much about punctuation and really, formulaic drafting, and that's lawyers and coders. And a good lawyer probably drafts in a very logic and systematic way anyway, but it is next level when you need to express that in code. So I think understanding at a conceptual level will be super helpful, but I just cannot see that contracts stay analog for too much longer. It just doesn't make sense. And I think there's some public data that says 9% is the average value leakage of cross contracts due to manual contract administration. If you look at any economy, any business, that's a huge, huge number of inefficiency that we currently have the technology to solve for. But we need to bring the lawyers along the journey.
Thank you so much. I will immediately sign up for a course at our university's computing school. Yeah, I just want to move on another question, but because that is directed to Susanna, but I think it actually is addressed to the entire panel. It concerns minimum requirements, data flows, etc. Right. So now the question, and perhaps Susanna can sort of take the lead in this first before we move on to the other speakers like Heng, Claudio, and Joey or Pasha, for their contribution. So basically, it's on minimum requirements. So this attendee says that I'm curious whether it will be possible to coordinate different requirements such as data regulation to set minimum requirements. For example, some countries have data localization laws, which would then sort of prevent cross-border data flow, right? Others may suggest free flow of data, right? So there is little progress in international consensus, and of course you can see why there is little international consensus from a number of different interest perspectives. So perhaps Susanna can kick off the discussion, and then we'll move on to Heng and Claudio.
Yes, another great question. Look, I have worked in international organizations. I worked for the UN for a little while, a long time ago. It is very difficult to reach consensus on big and complicated issues. I think we would approach this from, there's two comments that I would say is, when we talk about infrastructure for smart legal contracts, we think that needs to be jurisdictionally compliant with the laws in the local jurisdiction to begin with. We think it's very important that this type of infrastructure is regulated. We need to move away from the CryptoPunk kind of notion of digital assets sitting outside the law. That's certainly the case in Australia. So we think that having jurisdictionally compliant infrastructure in the first instance is really important. In terms of how you regulate cross-border transactions in that world, that is going to be a little bit more complicated, and I don't promise that anyone will reach consensus on these things, but the idea of trying to have a protocol that sets out common understanding or minimum requirements is there really to help as a resource to help developers, investors, regulators, users, legislators, and the judiciary when these things start to go wrong, to come together and have a shared understanding of how the technology works, what the legal issues are, and then how do we collectively try to solve for those problems.
Thank you. Hung, yes. I think that was one of the points raised in your discussion about Cbtc, coordinating the different laws, regulatory approaches, right, to cross-border data flows.
Thank you. I think this is a great question. I would echo that actually it won't be an easy job, as Susanna mentioned earlier. That recalls my experience with the World Trade Organization. Having over 100 now over 160 members, it's difficult to agree with even small issue, let alone those kind of sensitive data issue. So that shows that Cbtc give us a total different landscape, which never happened in cash flow. If you want to use cash in another country, carry cash with you and then use that. Won't happen, in Cbtc without an infrastructure system. So you cannot say, okay, here's my Cbtc. So wow, let's enjoy that. It probably won't fly well. So coming back to the issue, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think the backgrounds of the social or societal value differences compared with China vis-a-vis the US is an example of the data one. So I think it's what happening nowadays. We see that possibly one, as you mentioned in one of my paper, I think they may have hubs coming. So really see that a number of developing countries like Canada and the Fed, US, they are working on their Cbtc principles, and also China, Russia, and other countries also they have have the central bank meetings. So we like to see a kind of regional level, or hub level standards. But the problem we have is that maybe they may be a kind of parallel one. So they may not necessarily be convergent with each other. They may have discrepancies among them because of, and also more complex in the geopolitical dynamics we are seeing these days. And then the third question I'm thinking of, besides the social value and regional level, is that how do we address that? I think one thing is about maybe we can try to explore with the compatibility or interoperability. I think that's an undersupplied public goods, which has been happening in traditional money, but it may still even more difficult nowadays. But I think in terms of the legal perspective, the soft law or guidance, maybe a way to try to build more consensus. But I'm not sure that will easy to get those sensitive issues sorted out. They may have, it depends on political willingness. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Hung. Now I will now turn to Claudio and Joey. Any particular industry insights or workarounds, right? What would your suggestions be, right? If you speak to, governments, regulators.
Yeah, so I agree with the previous views that many of these projects so far have been started by single central bank and regulators, and I've been looking at trying to fit blockchain and Cbtc into the local regulations and structures. That said, we're starting to see more projects that are relying on regional or global collaboration to start defining governance models and standards that can be adopted across multiple jurisdictions as well. A good example of this is one of the projects I was mentioning earlier, which started with the Hong Kong Monetary Authority and Bank of Thailand collaborating on blockchain-based cross-border payments and Cdbc. Now, this project is expanding into a new phase, which will see also the participation of the United Emirates Central Bank and also People's Bank of China. So we see this type of forums where these central banks not only discuss among them, but also practically establish technology and test the technology and experiment with it as right vehicles to drive that type of regional and potentially in the future even global approaches where interoperability and common standards can emerge.
Joey, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that we are at a stage whereby we are fortunate and unfortunate. I mean, we're unfortunate because a lot of these in a lot of countries are still not set in rules yet, or we have laws that doesn't really quite fit with the new reality of how commerce is happening, how settlement is happening electronically, not least with trustless networks like your blockchains and whatnot. But we are also fortunate in the sense that I think at least in the region, our experience has been that the regulators and the governments, beyond consulting with each other, are very willing to consult and get views from the industry on what exactly needs to be there in terms of regulation. And I think that the one approach to trying to tackle issues, so for example, I'll give you an example of data localization. And one unique thing about data is that data is non-rivalrous, meaning my consumption of data does not diminish your consumption of it. It's the same. It doesn't get exhausted. And when it comes down to data localization, having that perception that data must be hoarded and we need to stop access to data, sometimes maybe the knee-jerk reaction of certain authorities or certain government, be it from a defensive perspective or they think from a control perspective. So the persuasion has to be that looking at what they are concerned about, if it's about control, if it's about access, can that control and access perhaps be similarly facilitated, even if the data is allowed to flow outwards? So it is that kind of persuasion and perspective that I think the industry can share in terms of regulation that enables data flows and enables commerce, that I think then is one of the coping mechanism and strategy in which we can try to do this. Of course, we are not always successful. And of course, there may be times where it may be a very stuck and draconian requirement requiring zero access, zero copying. It's not about any offshore, onshore kind of issue. And that is understandable. Then we navigate it within the context of them manipulating with what is permissible and what is not permissible. We can transform the medium of data, for instance, if there's a need to. So I guess it is still relatively early days, in terms of the regulation. But I think that puts you in a good position, both the industry and the academics, in terms of trying to shape some of the thinking around this, because people are willing to listen and authorities are willing to listen. Yeah. Thank you.
It's great to hear that. And also, I just, it occurs to me that, if countries take a very strict view towards cross-border data, then it might also, in that sense, impede data sharing, which is increasingly becoming important for businesses because it kind of create new value, right? When you can combine data sets and to get new insights. Now, and then I just want to bring us back to Pasha, right? On, at the trade agreement level, right? What do you think can be done to overcome some of these obstacles, right?
Well, thank you very much for this great question. And so in terms of the minimum requirement for cross-border data, that the question you posed, I do have several examples to share with everyone. For example, if we look at the ASEAN e-commerce agreement, it looks great, but it has a clause that says subject to domestic law and regulation. So basically, again, it creates vast policy space. And some people may mention that the Cptpp is a high-level requirement, and we know that Vietnam is a party to the Cptpp, but recently Vietnam passed cybersecurity. If we look at the law, it directly contravenes the Cptpp e-commerce agreement. But interestingly, you cannot sue Vietnam because there is an exception in the Cptpp, the exception about the transitional period granted to Vietnam. So you cannot sue Vietnam for this. So I call it bad faith implementation. So if we look at this issue, we know that dispute settlement mechanism is not probably the best way to enforce the problem, because once you have the dispute settlement mechanism that governs data issue, no country will want to sign the agreement. So based on the current practice, I would suggest that we have more robust review peer review mechanism. Such mechanism exists at the ASEAN level, at the APEC level, or even at the WTO level. So if we do have the mechanism that really evaluate each party or each country's e-commerce or data policy, and that would make the soft law requirements stronger. And that, I think that would be a more feasible way to promote the data, cross-border data. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I think in the interest of time, I have one question here I thought it's very interesting because it kind of asks us to think about what it's going to look like in the future, how will society look like in the future, right? So I think it can be addressed to all the speakers today, and perhaps you can just chime in on what your views are, right? So the question is this: I'm curious what society will look like in digital age in say 20 years through digital currencies. And I think we can sort of expand this question, not just digital currencies, but also digital contracts, accelerated digitalization, of almost a lot of functions of life, right? Will Cbtc cryptocurrencies be widely used, or in fact smart contracts, will it go beyond the niche areas that we see now? Right? Will they lead to more problems like privacy concerns or environmental problems? Right? Sustainability being the big banner for this year. Right? Can we get them right? Yeah. So yeah, this might be the last question. Yeah. So who would like to go first? Maybe Susanna.
Sure, I'll take that. Look, I'm an inherent optimist. I won't comment specifically on CBDCs, but I can see it from where we sit. Our clients at the moment in their businesses have hit this kind of pinnacle point of complexity. They are drowning in information. They are being increasingly required to understand more and more complex systems and organizations in real time and make decisions based on that incredible complexity. And the technology has led to that. And we're now at a point where humans can't solve for that on our own. We have to increasingly use technology to organize the chaos. And I think we will have to find solutions to some of the problems that were raised in the question in terms of how do we deal with data and privacy and all those things. We're going to need to leverage technology to simplify our lives because it's kind of peak crazy at the moment.
Thank you. Claudio?
Yeah, sure. I'm also an optimist and I'm also a technologist, so I have to look forward to the technology being developed. I think the two questions that have been raised are both valid, but if we start from the privacy concerns, I think the implementation of blockchain solutions are actually positive implementations because they mutualize data management and effectively remove data honeypots. So it should make data structure more robust and should prevent data leakage or uncontrolled use of data in the future. The other one is around environmental impact, which is also a very topical question, especially considering the recent announcements from Elon Musk and Tesla around this. I think, when it comes to the usage of private blockchain systems, like the ones that we are seeing being developed in the context of Cbtc systems and other financial services application and smart contracts, the environmental impact can be neglectable. We're not looking at public blockchain that consume tons of energy to stay in sync, but rather private blockchains that are controlled by trusted parties and therefore are more alike to distributed database and the energy consumption of that type of technology. The other interesting point
I will have to stop you there because of
that. That's right.
Yeah. So then, yeah. So perhaps we hear quickly from Joey before we move on to Pasha and just very quickly what your views are, Joey.
Okay, I'm a realist, so I'm somewhat optimistic, but not really so. But I think in short, one thing that I'm optimistic about is that, or I'm confident about, not optimistic, is that our relationship with technology will change our view of what is permissible under privacy and change our view of value exchange in terms of the use cases. And increasingly, at least from where I'm coming from, it looks to me that privacy will remain important, but not as important and as big a deal breaker as people might think. There's going to be a convergence in terms of the cultural attitudes towards privacy between the West and perhaps in the East, where we have oversimplification. And as a result of that, I expect technology and data collection, data use to proliferate and mushroom beyond what we possibly think is imaginable now. And I think
Thank
that
you.
is going to form a very different future. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And last words from Pasha and Hung.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think this issue is the data issues are very, very important. And there are so many important issues concerning technology, such as AI cooperation, fintech. Traditional trade rules, including FTA, cannot resolve these issues. So, but I think that Singapore provided a very good solution by concluding digital economic or partnership agreement with certain economies, like-minded countries, such as New Zealand, Australia. And so they address more detailed data issue. I think that's a great approach to dealing with this rapidly evolving area. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think I could jump in saying that I think it's important that to balance different and even competing consideration like security and safety. And the second, I think it's important to have experimental mindsets, so to explore the potential answer to the new issues. Finally, I think like what we are doing today, I think we need the teamwork, tech companies and law firms, banks, and also the academia and other stakeholders. So to explore what we can find a solution. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all the speakers for their time and sharing insights today. So just to close, to do the usual, which is to express my gratitude to Herbert Smith Freakill Civil Center at UNSW Law and Justice, especially Deborah Healy and Hung Wang, all attendees for your participation in the discussion, the administrator Wen Chen, Hannah, and Fion. Right, we are going to plan another joint CIBEL-CCLA event, and so keep checking back. We hope to see you soon again. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.